Today's spoiler video is brought to you by Card Kingdom. Use the link below to pre-order your cards today. Hello everyone, it's Seth, probably better known as Saffron Olive, and it's time for another daily dose of War of the Spark spoilers. And today, we get a couple of sweet planeswalkers to talk about, some interesting lower rarity stuff, powerful commons, uncommons, so we should probably jump right into it, start talking about these sweet new cards. Before we do, a quick reminder, well, two actually. First off, if you haven't checked it out, MTGPreviews.com will take you to the latest spoilers on the Goldfish site. So if you're looking for spoilers, that's the place to go for all the latest stuff. Also, if you haven't already, it would be super cool of you if you could take a second, click that subscribe button down at the bottom of your screen. It's a great way to support the channel and the site for free. So let's talk some more of the Sparks, starting with our rare planeswalker for the day, Sorin, Vengeful Bloodlord. And Sorin, Vengeful Bloodlord, kind of interesting. 4 mana, 4 loyalty. It's a rare planeswalker, which means 2 abilities plus a static ability. The static ability makes it so during our turn, our creatures and planeswalkers have lifelink, so way to gain a bit of life, which is nice. Plus 2, you get to deal 1 damage to a player or planeswalker, and then negative X, you get to return a creature with converted mana cost X from your graveyard to the battlefield. It's also a vampire. So Soren, what it reminds me of the most is probably a Johnny Adversary of Tyrants. You have similar mana cost, you have similar loyalty. There are some differences. The negative X on Soren reminds me of the negative 2 on a Johnny. Of course, you can't just grow your creatures with Soren, but you can deal some damage to planeswalkers, which is nice. And if you're in some sort of aggro-y type race, being able to give all your stuff lifelink is a pretty big swing. Like, you're attacking with a bunch of lifelinkers, your opponent attacks you back with a bunch of non-lifelinkers, you're gonna win that if you're playing some sort of like Orzhov versus mono-white type race or against mono-red that's trying to burn you out. So there's definitely some upside to that static ability. So I think that Soren most likely fits in 2 potential homes in Standard. First off, it makes a lot of sense in a vampire deck. In a vampire deck, you're trying to flood the board with cheap creatures that want to be attacking, so you really take advantage of the lifelink ability on Soren, where you're able to gain these massive chunks of life as you're swinging in with Adanto Vanguards and stuff pumped by Legion Lieutenant and whatnot. So that's kind of step 1. Step 2 is there's some sweet potential in an aristocrat style deck using that reanimation ability. If with your Cruel Celebrants and Judas to get triggers, Pitiless Pontiff is a sacrifice outlet, and then you can use Soren up to 4 times to get back something like Hunted Witness or Grim Initiate, and both of these cards potentially represent 2 creatures to sacrifice, which means multiple Judith triggers, multiple Celebrate triggers. So I think that's the other potential home, is really honing in on that negative X ability, trying to reanimate cheap creatures repeatedly again and again and again, and then using those bodies for value. So I think Soren, while it's definitely a unique planeswalker, it fits in probably a limited number of decks. I think if you're playing just a random like mid-rangey style deck, Soren loses a lot of its value compared to other planeswalkers. But if you're aggressive, or if you're trying to sacrifice stuff and get it back for value, Soren offers a lot of potential in that style of deck. Next up, we have an uncommon planeswalker in Nahiri, Storm of Stone, and this is our Boros hybrid planeswalker, and it's uncommon, so we only get 2 abilities, the static ability, 1 negative ability. So for 6 loyalty, your static ability is, as long as it's your turn, similar to Soren actually, creatures you control have first strike, and equipped abilities you activate cost 1 less, so you get to equip for 1 cheaper, and then negative X, you can deal X damage to a tapped creature. So Nahiri is a card that I'm not exactly sure where it fits. Obviously, maybe some sort of aggro deck, again like Soren, if you're playing these planeswalkers that are only giving you a static ability on your turn, you really want to be attacking with your creatures. So maybe like mono white aggro, giving your creatures first strike lets them win in combat. So that's a nice bonus. On the other hand, the equipment in Standard just aren't that good. This might be more of a commander card if you're playing an equipment deck in Commander, because right now, like, the best equipment in Standard are just kind of meh. Helm of the Host is really spicy, but it's more of a fun build around than a real win games type of card for the most part. Forebear's Blade, Blackblade Reforged, they're just not powerful in the sense where we've seen in the past, like Batter Skulls and the Sword Cycles. So that's kind of the downside, is I'm not sure you're going to get much value out of that cheaper activation cost unless we see a powerful equipment that hasn't shown up yet. Maybe there's something in War of the Spark that hasn't come along yet. The other awkward part of Nahiri is we were just talking about how you really want to be aggro because of the static ability that only does stuff in your turn. So you want to be attacking, you want to be attacking. The problem is Nahiri's negative X ability only gets tap creatures, which is actually slightly obnoxious if you're going to be aggro. So if your opponent just leaves all their stuff back on defense, you can't use Nahiri to get a blocker out of the way. And in an aggro deck, that's really what you want to be doing. Attacking, 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 getting blockers out of the way, attacking, attacking. So you kind of run into the seal away problem, or take vengeance problem, where you actually need your opponent to attack so you can use Nahiri, and your opponent's going to see Nahiri sitting on the battlefield. So they're probably not going to attack, especially since they know you're aggro. So I feel like the negative X ability, while there's some value in just like playing Nahiri, immediately negativing to something that's already tapped, once it's on the battlefield, that ability loses a lot of value, especially in the aggro decks that you're going to want to play Nahiri in. So overall, Nahiri does some sweet things, but I'm not super sold on Nahiri being standard playable. Like I said, maybe equipment style decks in Commander is a home for Nahiri, but as far as standard, I think there's probably better planeswalker options for most decks, because again, you're competing with Soren, you're competing with a Johnny, planeswalkers that are already in the format, already good in this style of deck, and I'm just not sure Nahiri is going to beat out the other options. We also got Single Combat, and this is a card that at first I misread it and I was a little bit excited about, but then after reading it correctly, I don't think this card is very good. 5 mana sorcery. Each player chooses a creature or planeswalker they control, sacrifices the rest. So each player goes down to one either creature or planeswalker. They keep their best thing. Then players can't cast creature or planeswalker spells until the end of your next turn. So when I first read this, I thought, okay, so you cast this, each player goes down to one planeswalker or creature, and then your opponent goes, they can't rebuild. You go, you get to rebuild, but that ability impacts both players. Like, both players can't cast creatures or planeswalkers until the end of your next turn. So what happens is you play this as a sorcery, your opponent goes down to their best thing, you go to your best thing. Your opponent untaps, they can't cast things, but they can use their creature, they can use their planeswalker, whatever they have left. Then it goes to your turn. You can use your creature or planeswalker, but you also can't cast things. And then it goes back to your opponent, and they get to rebuild first, while you still aren't really doing anything. So I have a hard time imagining a world where this is going to be a useful card. I guess the one upside is you can use this as like mass planeswalker hate. If we get to a point where in standard, we have decks that are playing 5 planeswalkers, and they just have a ton of planeswalkers on the battlefield all the time. Having a card that can get rid of 4 of those 5, that does have some amount of value, even with the weird restriction. But apart from being like super friends hate, essentially, I don't think this is playable, especially when we have Cleansing Nova, we have the new Azorius Wrath, we have a ton of 5-mana Wrath options, so I'm kind of thinking that Single Combat probably just going to be a card that literally doesn't see any play at all. Next on our list, we have the return of Krenko. Krenko, Tin Street Boss, and this is a pretty interesting Goblin Tribal style card. 3 mana, 1/2 Legendary Goblin. Whenever Krenko attacks, you put a counter on it, then you make X/1/1 Goblins, where X is Krenko's power. So normally you're going to play this, then you're going to attack, it's going to get that counter, you make 2 Goblins. Of course, if you use pump spells or something, or have a bunch of Lords, it gets even better. You can kind of spiral it out of control. So this is a card that I feel like is pretty much custom built for being at home in Goblin Tribal in Standard. And Goblin Tribal, it's a tribe that's not that far away from actually being competitive. We played Cavalcade Goblins, it was actually pretty sweet and pretty powerful, and Krenko, perfect for that, because it's making those 1/1 tokens to trigger Cavalcade. Actually, when you attack with it, it's 1 power the first time, unless it's pumped, and then you're going to get a trigger from Krenko as well. So Cavalcade Goblins is a home, and then we have a lot of Goblin Tribal pieces. Goblin Trashmaster gives us a Lord, pumps Krenko, more Goblins. Goblin Warchief to haste in Krenko, smash our opponent by surprise and get those Goblins. So Goblin Tribal, home number 1. On the other hand, there is one kind of catch, I think, to whether Krenko will actually see play, and that is the most powerful Goblin slot already in Standard is the 3-drop slot. Legion Warboss, very powerful Goblin, very good in both Cavalcade Goblins and Goblin Tribal, and then Goblin Chain Whirler, not as good in Cavalcade Goblins, although it's still just such a raw, powerful card that it's fine, but very, very good in Goblin Tribal, just a very strong standalone card. So my concern for Krenko is, while I think it's it's really good for goblins. Is it better than Legion Warboss and Chain Whirler? I'm not sure. And can you play more than 8 3-drop goblins? Also not sure, so it might be that Crankle's like a one-of, since it's legendary and kind of just falls a little bit behind Warboss and Chain Whirler, but we'll have to see. The other thing worth mentioning is if you're going on the token plan, Crankle goes way up in value. If you're trying to Divine Visitation, let's say, and playing some sort of like Goblin-esque Divine Visitation Boros deck, then you want Crankle, then you want Legion Warboss. Forget about Chain Whirler. Anything that makes tokens going to be insane, so that's the other possibility, is maybe Crankle doesn't show up as much in goblins, but in kind of janky, fun Divine Visitation decks is a way to make a bunch of goblins that are actually 4/4 Angels with Vigilance, which seems pretty powerful. So Crankle, super sweet card. I think it's actually a pretty powerful card. Is it more powerful than what we already have in Standard competing with it? That's my only concern, and I don't know the answer, but super sweet to see Crankle returning in a very powerful form. Next up, we have Storv Devkarin Lich, and Storv is a pretty powerful card, and in a lot of ways, it reminds me of Crankle. If you just read this card, it reads powerful. 4 mana, 5/4 trample, zombie, elf, wizard, so a few relevant creature types, and whenever it deals combat damage to a player or planeswalker, you get to return a creature planeswalker from your graveyard to your hand that wasn't put there during combat. So if you just like mash your entire team into your opponent's blockers and Storv gets through, you can't return something that died in that combat, but you can return something that was already in the graveyard. So Storv, the upside is it's got ready-built homes. We see graveyardy, Golgari, Sultai decks using like Jade Light Ranger, Merfolk Branchwalker. Those decks love grinding out value. They love getting stuff back from their graveyard, getting back your Hydroid Crosses or whatever. Very powerful, and Storv feels right at home in those decks. Like, you read this and you're like, okay, this fits perfectly in that style of deck, and maybe it will. On the other hand, the downside of Storv is it doesn't do anything right away. You play it, you gotta pass the turn, you gotta untap with it, then you actually gotta get through a hit for it to really do anything, and that means it's open to being killed by Lava Coil, Obnixilus's Cruelty, Vraska's Contempt, and that's fine. This isn't the, oh, it dies to Doomblade so it's not good. The problem is, we have a bunch of other options in the 4-drop slot in the same exact style of deck that do something right away. So Storv, while it's good, the real question is it better than Golgari Finebroker, Ravenous Chupacabra, Vraska Golgari Queen? There's so many options in the 4-drop slot, and these are all cards that give you immediate value. You avoid that Lava Coil problem where you pass the turn and your opponent's like, all right, I kill your thing. So you get around that with all of these cards. So that's going to be my question. I think that Storv is powerful enough that people will play it, and I think it will show up in decks, but it might be, again, more of like a one-of card because it's legendary and because of that removally downside, and because there's just an insane amount of competition. And remember, with all of these cards, with Crankle, with Storv, we're going to be getting to rotation this fall, and then everything changes. A lot of the cards that Storv and Crankle are competing with are going to be gone. There's no Goblin Chain Whirler. There's no more Ravenous Chupacabra. Those cards are out of the format, and then all of a sudden, you're reevaluating these cards and looking at them in a very different light. So it might be that some of these cards are not good enough to immediately show up in our massive standard with so many sets, but are very strong after rotation when they're competing with less competition. Next up, we have a pretty interesting uncommon, God Pharaoh's Statue. So 6 mana legendary artifact, spells your opponent's cast, costs 2 more to cast. That is a big tax, and at the beginning of your end step, each opponent loses a life. So this is basically a double Sphere of Resistance, except it only impacts your opponent. So you're getting this massive taxing effect, and the thing I like about this card, especially in Standard, is it's also a clock. Normally prison pieces are just prison pieces, and they slow down your opponent, but they don't technically help you win the game. They just keep you from losing the game by making your opponent not do anything. Even though it's just 1 life a turn, if you can lock your opponent hard enough, that 1 life is eventually going to get there, so it's kind of similar to Ill-Gotten Inheritance. That said, in Standard, I'm not sure where the home for this card is. 6 mana is a lot. By the time you're casting a 6 mana spell, your opponent's probably already played most of their hands, so the taxing effect gets a little less important, although it is good against like Arclight Phoenix decks that need to chain together cantrips, so maybe that's a possibility, but even there, is it just too slow? That's the question. On the other hand, in older formats, we have ways to get it out a lot faster. In Modern, you got Tron, can cast this on turn 3. Arbor Elf, Utopia Sprawl, same deal. You can be casting God Pharaoh statue on turn 3, so maybe it's in the conversation there. And things get even crazier when you go back to like Vintage, where you have Mishra's Workshop, which just 2 of them let you cast God Pharaoh statue right away. You can tinker it out on turn 1 potentially with Moxen and whatnot, and if you are making all your opponent's stuff cost 2 more as early as turn 1, that can just win you the game on its own. Like your opponent, you untap, you do this, you play all your stuff, your opponent untaps, they have to land go, because they literally can't cast any of their spells. So I think this is a card that I'm mostly excited for in older formats, but it's definitely powerful. The only question is, can you get it on the battlefield quick enough to be relevant? I'm not sure you can in Standard, but in older formats, there's a lot more potential for God Pharaoh's statue. We also have some really powerful lower rarity stuff. So Saurons Thirst was very good last time it was in Standard, just 2 black, instant speed, 2 damage to a creature, you gain 2 life. The problem we see here is Moment of Craving is close to strictly better, because like Adanto Vanguard is in the format, so being -2/-2 rather than 2 damage is actually a pretty meaningful upside right now. So I think that maybe Sorin's Thirst is a card that, similar to some of the other ones we're talking about, it might start off slow, because I think right now, like, you just 100% of the time you want Moment of Craving over Sorin's Thirst. However, well, I should say 99% of the time. There is one exception. If you're playing a Pestilent Spirit deck, that changes, but no one's really playing Pestilent Spirit decks. But 99.9% of the time, you just want Moment of Craving over Sorin's Thirst. But in the future, Moment of Craving won't be a thing, and then there's a chance that Sorin's Thirst is a staple removal spell, because we're still going to have Mono Red, we're still going to have Mono White. Those decks are always around, and having this life gain, life buffer removal spell for the early game, pretty important to slower black mid-range and control decks. We also got a couple of really powerful zombies. So Grim Initiate is basically the zombie hunted witness. 1 mana, 1/1, has first strike. When it dies, you amass, so you get a 1/1 as long as you don't have an army. So it's very similar to Hunted Witness, except it has the zombie creature type, and having a 1-drop that is powerful and works with your Death Baron, pretty big deal. Next up, we have another super powerful zombie. Lazotep Reaver is basically the zombie goblin instigator, and this card seems very important to zombie tribal. Comes down on turn 2, as long as you haven't amassed yet, you get the Reaver as a 1/2, you get a 1/1 zombie army, which makes it like an improved goblin instigator on turn 2, and then you can play Death Baron on turn 3 and just start attacking with all these zombie bodies that are buffed by your lord. So I think that this card is extremely important to the zombie tribal plan. Goblin Instigator, similar cards, Mog War Marshal, kind of staples of Goblin Tribal. I see Lazotep Reaver being something else. With that double zombie body on turn 2, into Lord on turn 3, that is a scary fast start. So I think that Lazotep Reaver, if zombies are a thing, it's definitely going to be part of it. Then we have Lazotep Plating. It's apparently Lazotep Day, which kind of reminds me of Heroic Intervention. You amass 1 at instant speed, and you and permanents you control gain hexproof until end of turn. So the downside is your stuff doesn't also gain indestructible like Heroic Intervention, although the upside is you get to amass 1. However, if you're worried about a big main fire to the face or Settle the Wreckage ruining your board, Lazotep is a good way to save that, and it also saves your planeswalkers. You and permanents you control gain hexproof, so if your opponent's gonna Vraska's Contempt your Teferi, this does fizzle it similar to a counter spell and leave behind a body. So I feel like Lazotep's Plating might be more of a sideboard card for specific matchups, but it's pretty powerful for just 2 mana. Finally, a bunch of lower rarity stuff that is not as exciting. Limited only type stuff. I don't think any of this stuff will really see play in Standard. Nahiri Stoneblades, double pump for 2 mana is not bad. Maybe some aggressive deck would want it. It is technically +4 damage if you get out unblock creatures. Gleaming Overseer is also kind of interesting. 3 mana 1/4, plus you get to amass 1. So if it's a 3 mana 1/4 that does make the zombie token because you don't already have an army, you're technically getting 2 power and 5 toughness for 3 mana, and you're giving your zombie tokens, your amassed army, hexproof and menace. So maybe if there is some sort of amass deck, this could show up. But really, I think most of these cards are mostly limited fodder, unexpected to show up in Standard. Anyway, those have been our daily War of the Spark spoilers for today. So let me know what you think in the comments. How good is Nahiri? What about the new Soren? Are these planeswalkers going to show up in Standard? All this zombie stuff. Is zombie tribal going to be a thing? How about single combat? Am I missing something that makes that card better than it looks at first glance? God Pharaoh statue. Can that be a lock piece in Standard, in Modern, in older formats? What about Krenko and Storev? Are those cards that we gotta wait until after rotation, or can they see play right away, right now? Let me know in the comments. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed it, and I will talk to you soon. Thanks for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, help us out by clicking that like button down below. And to keep up on all the latest and greatest, click that subscribe button. And don't forget to hit that bell icon to get alerts whenever we have new videos. And if you want to, check out some of our other sweet videos here and here.